Hi everyone, this is Instructor Hernandez, and in this video lecture I will be going over strategies for revising and editing essay number 1. When you first start revising your essay, it's very helpful if you come up with goals for revising that are specific to your essay. We had our peer review in class on Monday, and hopefully you received some helpful feedback from your peers during the peer review. And I know that some of you also met with Instructor Campbell this week, and you may have also met with a writing tutor at the LRC. So taking into consideration all of the feedback that you've received so far, you want to come up with specific goals for yourself. That way too, it doesn't seem so overwhelming when you sit down to revise your final draft. Some potential goals that you may want to address include if there are any portions of your essay that need to be more focused, specifically your thesis statement, your paragraphs, or your conclusion. Additionally, if anyone that read your essay mentioned your ideas are good, but they need to be more fully explained, then that would be a good area to focus on as well. And finally, you want to make sure that your sentences and your language is clear. And I'll explain this more in a couple of slides. Once you come up with your goals for revision, it's helpful to make a plan, especially knowing that the due date for the final draft is this Sunday. And after you've taken stock of what needs to be revised in your essay, you want to come up with a realistic estimate of the time and also the energy you have for those revisions. It's very difficult to sit down and revise an entire essay in just one sitting. For one, you may not have the energy to do this and you may run out of steam towards the end, and your revision may not be as effective as it could be if you had more energy. Also, you may not have enough time to revise everything in your essay at once. So you want to think about what realistically you can accomplish by the due date and breaking up your revision plan into smaller tasks. That way it will be much more doable for you. It'll probably be a lot less stressful and you will be able to get more done. In terms of your revision tasks, these are some common things that we tend to focus on in terms of revising the final draft. You may need to cut existing material, especially if you receive feedback that either your sentences or your paragraphs were too wordy or too lengthy. You also want to make sure that your essay is not being repetitive in terms of the ideas you mention or your word choice. If you remember the sample draft that we went over in class on Monday, I pointed out a paragraph where the writer had started 3 sentences in the same paragraph in a very similar way. So if, like I said, if you've received feedback on your own essay that some of the material is either too lengthy or too repetitive, then this is a good area to focus on. A common task is also adding new material, especially if your first draft was a bit underdeveloped. Adding new material can include more details of your personal experience or providing more evidence or examples. If one of your paragraphs raises an important topic that's related to your thesis statement, and that paragraph provides a reason in support of your thesis, you want to make sure you have evidence or an example to back that up. And finally, a very common task at this stage of writing is taking the material you already have in your essay and just reorganizing it. I mentioned in class on Monday that first drafts are often where we're just getting our ideas out on paper. So now that you've done that, you want to take a step back and think, can the material that I already put into my essay be reorganized in a way that makes more sense? And for this step, I like to recommend that students do what's called a reverse outline. What that means is you create an outline for your final draft that's based on the material you already have in your preliminary draft. And then I tell students to start the final draft on a new document rather than trying to edit or revise your preliminary draft. And you would base your final draft off of the reverse outline that you create. I know this can seem a little daunting to start completely fresh for a final draft, but oftentimes you'll find that you end up writing a much better draft by starting on a new document, a new sheet of paper, rather than trying to edit what you already have written. In terms of editing and proofreading, your goal should be to make your writing as clear as possible. And editing and proofreading our own work can be pretty difficult. We can read something we wrote and we know it doesn't sound clear, but we're not entirely sure how to make it sound more clear. So for this stage, I would really recommend getting help, and I'll explain some resources for you for editing and proofreading on the next slide. When we're editing and proofreading, there are certain things we want to focus on for both paragraphs and sentences. In terms of your paragraphs, you want to make sure that the focus of each paragraph is clear and that each paragraph has a clear topic sentence. You also want to check that all the sentences in one paragraph not only relate to one another, but the order of your sentences makes sense. So think about the order in which you're presenting your ideas and how the order would make sense to the reader. Sometimes all we need to do is move a few sentences around in a paragraph, and we'll see that the paragraph flows much better. And finally, we also addressed this in class on Monday. Are your paragraphs in need of transitions, especially as you go from one idea to the next? And the sample draft that we looked at in class had a good example between two of the body paragraphs in terms of using transitions. So that would be good to refer back to see a good example. When we're editing and proofreading our sentences, we're looking for a few specific things. One is we want to make sure we're using complete sentences. I remarked on some of your drafts that you either had sentence fragments or sentence run-ons. So if that's the case, you want to go back and edit those sentences so that way they are complete. You also want to make sure you're using a lot of sentence variety. So if your sentences are common in terms, or I'm sorry, if they're similar in terms of their structure, it may be good to mix it up and have sentence variety. And there's a section in the Little Seagull Handbook that goes into more detail about this, which I'll mention in a moment. Finally, it helps our sentences be more clear when we have what is called parallelism. And parallelism can refer to a lot of different aspects of a sentence. For instance, you want to make sure that all of your verbs are in the same form. If you go from, for instance, jump to running in the same sentence, that's going to confuse the reader. If you say, I know how to jump and running really well, you can just hear how that's very unclear. You also want to make sure that you're using parallelism in terms of your tenses. So a lot of you are talking about past experiences that you've had, and in that case you would want to use the past tense. So if we were to be writing a sentence or a paragraph in the past tense, and then we suddenly switch to present or future tense, that is also going to confuse the reader. As I mentioned before, proofreading our own work can be very difficult, and I highly recommend reaching out for help at this stage of the writing process. You can use the grammar and spell checker that is in Microsoft Word, or I know there's other computer-based programs such as Grammarly, which can be really good resources. However, they're not always 100% accurate. I still think it's a good first step to use computer-based grammar and spell checkers, but you also want to get additional feedback. The Learning Resource Center on campus has a section on grammar resources that you might find very helpful. And they also have grammar specialists that you can meet with one-on-one, either in person or online. And during these sessions, the tutor that you meet with is just going to focus on the grammar in your essay specifically and help you edit your paper. So if you haven't already used this resource, I would highly recommend it, especially before the final draft is due. And finally, if you have other peers that may be useful in terms of proofreading your essay, for instance, if you have a friend or roommate that's really good at grammar and you ask them to look over your essay and just tell you which parts are not clear, which sentences are not clear to them, that's a really useful way for us to get feedback, is when we get an outside perspective. The last thing that I want to go over for the final draft is MLA format. So in our class, since it is an English class, all of the essays should be in MLA format. And if you look at page 192 in the Little Seagull Handbook, you will see a section that is very detailed on MLA format. It does mostly refer to research, such as when you're doing a research paper in MLA, which we're not doing for this essay. But if you look at the sample essay on page 192, you can see how to format the essay itself, specifically the first page, which is where you need to pay the most attention. So in terms of MLA format, your entire essay should have the following: 1-inch margins all around the page, 12-point font, and I don't require a specific font to use, although I would recommend either Times New Roman or Arial, because those are the most professional looking fonts and they're also easy to read for me. You also want to make sure that the essay is double spaced throughout, and you have a header that lists your last name and then the page number of each page of your essay. If you're typing your essay in Microsoft Word, you may need to adjust these settings before you start writing, because sometimes the margins or the spacing will be automatically set and it will not be in MLA format. So before you start writing your final draft, I would just make sure that you have all of these settings correct on your computer. On the first page, you want to have the following information: your full name, and that will come first. It will be followed by my name, then the name of the class, and the date of your essay. You should also come up with a unique title for your essay, and this will be centered on the first page. And once again, to see a sample of an essay in MLA format, you would go to page 192 in the Little Seagull Handbook. Here are some additional resources for you to read on your own as you're working on your final drafts. So you'll remember that in class on Monday, we looked over the first draft of the essay, Ready, Willing, and Able. And in that same attachment that's on Canvas, you can see the writer's final draft. So it would be really helpful to compare the final draft to the first draft that we read in class and see what kind of changes the writer made and the difference between the two. And finally, these are some of the sections that I referenced from the Little Seagull Handbook. Sections W, 4, E, and F detail revising and editing. If you receive feedback that your paragraphs need more work, section W5 goes really in depth on how to write coherent paragraphs, so I would highly recommend reading this section. The edit section in your book, and that's just simply what it's called, is edit, and it is the yellow section, goes into a lot of detail in terms of grammar. So if you receive feedback that you need to work on sentence structure or language, I would recommend you go through this section in addition to the other grammar resources that I shared. And finally, the green section in your handbook deals with MLA style. So once again, this is not a research essay. You don't need a works cited page or anything like that. So in terms of the MLA style, I would just pay attention to how the sample essay is formatted, particularly the first page. Just a reminder, your final drafts are due this Sunday and they are due on Canvas. You won't bring your essay to class. So make sure you upload your essay by the deadline. If you have any questions about the essay, feel free to email me before the deadline. Good luck with your essays, and I look forward to reading them.